Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're taking a look at Wolfwald. This is a box set released by Lost Pages and written by L. Reynoldson. That is a setting with some rules for a fantasy version of Anglo-Saxon England. Interestingly, this isn't the first role-playing game we've looked at that's set in this same time period or one very similar to it. Previously, we looked at Wolves of God. Interesting how they both have Wolf in their title. You can check this out on my channel if you want to see a review of what's inside here. This is based on the Worlds Without Number system. This is more based on early D&D in that it's quite compatible with BX D&D or original Dungeons & Dragons. Here's the back of the box. To a Thane, the wolf pack is little more than a tool, and what a wolf pack can do is threaten, beat, rob, murder, and terrorize his enemies. Wolfwald is a role-playing game set in a world of mythic Anglo-Saxon tales. You are a wolf's head, an outcast adventurer trying to regain a place in society, in a world filled with mythic monsters, dark and dangerous magic, and even more dangerous rulers. This box set contains 5 booklets and a map. So we have one for character creation, one for magic, one for the campaign setting, and 2 that are both bestiaries, one for monsters and one for people. Here is the cloth map it comes with. It's so big it doesn't quite all fit in camera, but it is all done by Russ Nicholson, the famed fantasy artist who did a lot of work with things like Fighting Fantasy before he passed away tragically. But it is a great piece of fantasy map making. Hopefully you can see most of it here. Lots of different locations and towns and these minor petty kingdoms that you can travel through with roads connecting them all. You can see where all the forests and the rivers and all the different zones are. It is not a hex map, so there really isn't a strict procedure for how you travel around. You could just measure on the map, I suppose, or run it more narratively. Book 1 out of the 5 booklets is Wolf's Heads, and this is for the players, and it mostly focuses on character creation. So first it looks at what type of game is Wolfwald. So this is a game where you are, you're fantasy adventurers, but it's much more grounded and much more gritty. It's in this Anglo-Saxon-ish England, this sort of world that's awfully similar to mythic England. And you are an outlaw. You are an outcast. You are literally beyond the reach of the law in the sense that you have no rights. If anyone approached you and didn't like the look of you, they could kill you and there would be no penalties for them whatsoever. It's really up to you to decide how you got in this position, but your main goal here is to band together with the other player characters who are also wolf's heads, and you are working for a local lord because he needs, it's a little bit like Suicide Squad. You're an elite group of commandos who can do things that he wants to get done. You'll do his dirty work, and maybe you'll gain a little bit of respect for doing so. So this is designed and written for a different style of play than the wilderness exploration and dungeon delving of a traditional game. Not a lot of dungeoneering here. This is about raids. It's about commando missions given to you by a local lord that he sends you off on. And when you return and you report on how the mission went, if he likes what you've done, you get experience points. That's the only way you get experience points, is by pleasing your lord and completing these missions. Rather than in traditional D&D having 10 or 20 levels, there are only 3 levels in Wolfwald, where you have your lowest level, medium level, and high level characters. And we'll see how the stats work. There's just big jumps in power level between each of these. We have to get up to 4,000 XP to get the Hildewolf and 32,000 to get, I'm not going to try and pronounce that. There's a lot of Anglo-Saxon terminology in here, which I have a very hard time pronouncing, but it often explains it in normal English what it means, so you can get the gist of it. And this is a very thematic element where once you have reported back to your lord, he will give you treasure, because a good lord is a ring giver, a treasure giver. And the more treasure that he gives you, or the better the treasure is rather, the more XP it will grant you. Next up, let's look at how to generate characters in Wolfwald, but first a quick shout out to today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Aetherdark, a third-party expansion for Shadowdark that lets you pilot a fantasy warship between worlds, now on Kickstarter. This supplement has everything you need for sailing the astral sea. It has over 40 new astral phenomena to encounter, 18 fully unique ship maps, and an extensive collection of worlds to visit, and even an introductory campaign to kick off your saga. The core book includes rules for crew versus crew and ship versus ship combat, rules for modifying ships, 40 pages of random tables for generating new worlds to visit, guidelines for bounty hunting, trade missions, and astral exploration. You get tons of new monsters, crews, NPCs, and so much more. The Kickstarter closes on May 20th, so check it out right now using the link in the description. All right, creating a character. So as in early D&D, creating a character is very straightforward and characters are pretty simple. You have your 6 basic abilities right here, and you will be rolling them with 3d6 in order. And the biggest minuses and bonuses that you're going to get are +2 or -2. So not a big range of modifiers here. There's hit points and hit dice just like in traditional D&D, and there's also this stat of magic power, and this represents your innate magical abilities, which will be used in certain circumstances when you're dealing with the magic system. And so this is always equal to your level, plus the modifier for one of your abilities. When it comes to kindred or race, your options are elves, or dwarves, or men of earth. These are what most characters in the setting are, or these guys who are the outlanders. They're more on the fringes of society, on the borders. They're more wild men, so to speak. If the men of earth are like people from Britain, these people would be more like the Welsh or the Irish. Now, when it comes to classes, there are 3 basic classes: warrior, skirmisher, and wizard, but each of the different kindreds has a different version of these 3 classes. So by picking the kindred and class, you end up with a unique combination. So first of all, let's look at how the warrior looks for each of those different kindreds. For the elf, it's the elf wood guard. And you can see that there's the 3 levels right here, where you have 1d6, 4d6, or 8d6 hit dice as you level up. So there's these big step ups in power instead of a more smooth gradation in traditional D&D. They often have a couple of special abilities, but there's nothing really intense that you have to keep track of. Like there's some criticals and fumbles that are a bit different, and they often have a special ability like heroic effort right here, where you can do one really powerful thing per adventure. You can try to do it more often, but you get it once guaranteed if you really need to come from behind and you're in a dire situation. For the dwarves, it's the dwarf shield brother, and he gets up to 8d8 plus 8 hit dice. So that is a really beefy character. And his heroic effort is shield charge. Once per adventure, he can charge the enemy and knock them to the ground. The enemy takes some damage, is knocked prone, stunned, and unable to act in the following combat round. 2 enemies fighting side to side can be charged at level 2 and 3 at level 3. So you can just bulldoze your way through enemy forces. For the men of earth, you have the shield maiden, and she can challenge enemies and they have to accept if you really like dueling people. The outlanders have the battle strong, who can make these big sweeping attacks and hit multiple characters. In the skirmisher classes, we have the elf shooter. And then for the dwarves, we have the dwarf death dealer. He has like this crossbow that can shoot these little metal pellets at rapid speed. Not super Dark Ages-ish, but there's some fantasy elements in here. For the men of earth, it's the spear terror, where you are really, really good at throwing spears. You're extremely accurate at them. You get like +7 at the highest levels for your spear throwing, and you can pin people to stuff and do extra damage. The outlanders get the bowmen, and you have special drugged arrows. You can add paralysis, sleep, berserk, fear, blindness, or hallucination to your arrows if you really want to get some extra effects in there. There's a whole system for magic for each of these classes that we'll look at separately, but briefly, for the wizards, the elf get spell slingers, the dwarves get fate weavers, the men of earth get shining ones, and the outlanders get the witch. Now, the gear section is mostly looking at the different types of weapons that you can pick up. And what I like about these is that they're very straightforward. There's just a damage number for each of these weapons from the different kindreds, but there's also a good amount of description as to what the weapon looks like and how you would use it in battle. So what this does is it allows you to be a bit more creative with it, because if you can visualize what the weapon actually looks like, then you can think of creative uses for it, or you can find areas in the battlefield where it would be more effective. And if you can make that case to your game master, you're probably going to get bonuses from it. The dwarves, of course, are famous for their craftsmanship, so they have some really excellent armor and weapons, and they even have dragon eggs. We'll see the relationship to the dragons later on, but they can throw these eggs that have special effects, so it's a little bit like different types of grenades. At the back of this pamphlet, there's a couple of appendixes like Anglo-Saxon names, which is really great for naming your character, some notes on how to pronounce all of those Anglo-Saxon words, and some ideas for backgrounds when you are developing your character. How did you become a wolf's head? What horrible thing did you do that got you cast out of society? And if you want to adapt this for things like old school essentials, there is some adaptation notes here as well, which is quite nice. Booklet number 2 is all about magic, because there are different magic systems for each of the 4 magic classes. The first one is the dwarves' runic fate weaving. So there's all of these runes right here, and they're divided into 3 groups. Level 1 character gets access to all of these runes, level 2 gets the first 2 rows, and a level 3 character gets all of them. There's some really neat twists as to how these runes are used, though. They all have different magical effects, but once you use a rune, you cannot use it again until you have used all of the other runes that you know. So by level 3, you have to actually cast all 33 different runes before you get access to them all back again. I think that's really neat, because it forces you to really diversify your magic. You can't just find one tactic to use over and over again. You must get creative and think about how all of these different effects could be used. To cast a rune, you're going to be rolling d20 underneath your character's wisdom, plus your level, with penalties for how difficult it is, because there's 3 levels of difficulty here, and there's guidelines for figuring out where the difficulty is, because it is a more freeform system where it gives you an effect and you can decide how that is applied. There's 3 basic ways you can use a rune. You can just cast it like a normal spell, although normally you are supposed to spend a while preparing to cast it. If you cast it on the fly, it's going to be more difficult. Warding and binding, you can set a rune to activate when certain things happen, like a trap, and you can actually inscribe it on objects to give it permanent magical abilities, although this will remove your ability to use that rune at all until that thing is destroyed. Here we can see the meanings of all of the different runes. For example, this one is the road, and it relates to travel, rewards, riding, spiritual journeys, change, or soul. But you can also reverse it, and it could mean delay, crisis, and setbacks. So again, you have to take these meanings and interpret them and find a way that using this rune would be useful for you in your given circumstance. And you have to adjust its power level, because the more powerful you want to make it, the more penalties the game master is going to set. There's things like hail and need, ice, spear, hearth, elk, birch, horse, water, homeland, day. Very open-ended in terms of how you can use these. The elves have spell singing, which gives them a number of special abilities. They can shapeshift a certain number of times per day, and the higher level you are, the more things you can turn into. You have the glamour ability, where you can mind control people and get them to do what you want, always terrifying. And Songs of the Forest. You are a very forest-based class, and you have a lot of things that you can do when you're in that environment. For example, you could create a cloak of leaves that makes you invisible while in a wooded area. If you're one of the men of earth, then you can become a necromancer, one of the most terrifying and feared classes across all of Wolfwald. If someone knows that you're a necromancer, they might just try and kill you outright just for that. So you have to hide it at all times and only reveal it to people who you think are probably not going to be so terrified of you. Using your abilities will cause taint, which can eventually corrupt you and start really wearing your character down. So you got to be careful with how much you use it. There's a number of things you can do with necromancy, like Deathly Fatigue, the Call of Fear to just terrify your enemies, which is really great in combat. So if you can make them run away, then that solves your problem. Call of the Underworld, you can actually summon phantoms who can do terrifying things and have special abilities, like having Eldritch Lightning or Shining Shade or Skeletal Skin, making them much harder to injure. I really like this one here, the Call of Kinship. If you want to get all Hamlet on someone, you can create the shade of one of their dead ancestors, or it sure looks like that, and you can really get inside their head and start influencing them to do what you want, and maybe take over the kingdom that way. You can also create Orkneas, which are orcs, or basically zombies. Very powerful warriors that will do your bidding and are very difficult to kill. If you're one of the Outlanders, then you can become a witch, and there are 9 different special abilities that witches can learn. But the more that they learn, the more of a price that they pay. They start losing attributes, and they can even start losing hit points. They also have a familiar that comes into play with a number of these special abilities. So the 9 elements are the 9 herb charm to help heal people. You can curse people, a variety of different possible curses right here, from fairly mild to really, really bad. There's the green candle. You can scry on people. You can craft amulets. You can make potions. So they're really much a jack of all trades in terms of getting different stuff done. You can make poisons, venoms, and you can even use the poppet and the thorn. This craft involves a wax effigy and a thorn, so the witch can torment and harm her enemies from a safe distance. Chapter 2 is all about magic items, but what's fascinating is that there is a relatively small number of examples given here, but every example comes with a whole story. What is this weapon's backstory? Who made it? What did they make it for? This makes each magic item much more interesting. It really ties it into the setting, and it feels a lot more momentous when your character manages to find one, because now you feel like you are also part of history. You know the feats that this item has been used for in the past, and perhaps you can replicate those again in your own adventures. I think it's a really smart way of incorporating the fairy tale feel into the campaign. Chapter 3 is on the gods and religions of Wolfwald, which is mostly cultural background. The oldest god is this giant dragon, which the dwarves happen to worship. And then the other cultures have more gods, with brief little write-ups right here. They are not present in the sense that D&D gods often are. The characters worship them, they believe they're real, and maybe they are real, but they are not directly interfering with the world. You can see that the new gods of Wolfwald here are all the traditional Norse gods. There's a lot of great references at the back summarizing the different magic systems with these little sheets that you can print out that makes it much easier to track what you can and can't do. Book 3 is all about the campaign setting itself. So we start getting into all of the different zones that are on the map right here and fleshing them out. Who is there? What is their culture like? What kind of encounters can you find there? There's always a ruler for each of these different kingdoms. What is their banner like? And what is the political situation in that kingdom like? They're different in every single kingdom, which I really like. So depending on where you go on the map, you can have different sorts of campaigns. Do you want to have a lot of courtly intrigue where there is maybe a queen and she is being besieged by all of these different suitors trying to take over the kingdom? Or do you want to venture into the middle of a civil war where a whole bunch of brothers are fighting over who's going to be the next king? There's lots of different possible options here, depending on the tone that you are going for. And there's plenty of encounters too that add a lot of flavor. So for example, this one is the kingdom with the queen and all of the suitors. And one of the encounters is a priestess is traveling the kingdom, encouraging the suitors to put greater effort into wooing the queen. She's in fact the queen's cousin and is encouraging the suitors into ever increasing stupidity in their efforts. The kingdoms of Geatlund and Westland Jute are locked in a constant state of warfare as they're involved in all these border disputes as to who owns whose land. You have Wolfingas, the borderlands. The section on Wolfwald society describes what the early medieval society was actually like. What is the social order from the king all the way down to the outlaw where you begin? And how do all of these social classes relate to each other? How is land divided up? Where you have a hide, which is as much land as you need for a family to live on, and then a tithing, which is I think 10 of those, 100, which is 100 of those, and a shire, which is even larger than that. And that tells you exactly how many men in an area can raise for warfare. And it's a lot smaller than you might think. Armies at the time could be just hundreds of men. There's a section on how all the different social classes would feel about the PCs. How do the peasants feel about outlaws? How do thanes feel about them? What is everyone's opinion on wizards? I like how there's a lot of practical advice in writing your own Wolfwald. The author does not assume that you'll be running this setting exactly as written. He assumes that you will be tailoring it to what your group of players actually likes. It covers everything from where to start to casting the NPCs, how to build a campaign structure, and there is an extended example of him building the start of a campaign from all of these pieces, so you can see what exactly that's going to look like. He advises that you have a number of different missions available to the PCs at any time so they can pick what they want to do. That way they can select their own fun, and you can avoid things becoming too railroady. However, if you've read all of this advice and you still feel a little overwhelmed and you want some more concrete material that you can use to help build your adventures and build your campaigns, I recommend checking out my book, Knave 2nd Edition, which pairs really well with any kind of fantasy RPG and has tons of random tables to help build that. For example, here is a giant list of missions that you could easily steal to create stuff for your players to run. Maybe they run into a random NPC, lots of random tables for generating NPC details, assets, liabilities, relationships, mannerisms, and so forth. Basically a bottomless pit of more material to help flesh out any fantasy world. I think it's funny that Appendix A is optional rules, but these are essentially the rules to run the game, and they're optional because you could run this game in a very freeform manner if you wanted, or just use original D&D. I think this section here is especially important because your racing class is going to affect how people see you very strongly in this world, and there's lots of modifiers that you can use here. The combat order is a bit involved. There's 10 phases where different classes go at different times. It seems a bit too involved for me personally, but some people like it. And there is an example mission that you can start out on, which I think was actually a lot of fun. You're going to this fort, and the fort is being taken over by these white and red roses. And it seems to be possessing people's minds. Everyone is wearing either a white or a red rose, and that is making them hate the other side. And now the town is breaking out into violence, and they all want you to join their team. And by putting on a white or a red rose, you can immediately ally yourself with one or the other, but it's going to start mentally affecting you as well. I feel like there's plenty of opportunity for social shenanigans there. If you're clever, you can find out that at the center of the town, there is a well. And if you go down the well, you can find this weird creature that is the source of all of the vines. And if you defeat it, you can even get its magical whip. Other appendixes include how to run a warband. If you start having units of troops that are working for you, you might have to move to more abstract warfare as these larger groups clash with each other. There is rules for siege warfare, although, it's the Dark Ages, so it's fairly primitive. You'll have battering rams, basically, and you'll be trying to scale walls. No big siege engines. And there is some more name generators and personality stuff for your Fearedmen. Books 4 and 5 are monsters and NPCs. So starting off with monsters, this is going to be your bestiary. And similarly to what we saw with the magic items, there is a lot of backstory for each one of these monsters. They're not just plug and play creatures where they're not connected to the setting. All of these things have a history. The NPCs that you run into know about these creatures. They've heard their legends. They are tied into the world. For example, the big mother dragon, probably the most powerful character in the entire setting, has been imprisoned by the dwarves. The dwarves still worship this dragon, which they see as their god, because they use its flames to run their forges. However, the dragon obviously hates the dwarves for doing this to her, so if you ever free her, she will probably escape and cause absolute havoc across the land, wiping out every dwarf that she can find. There's the Cauldronborn, if you remember that from the Black Cauldron in the Book of Three. Those are some great books. Doom Goats, another great example of a social monster, where there's these human-like goats that perch on top of houses and buildings and just stare down accusingly at someone. And what are they accusing them of? Well, it's unclear, but everyone starts feeling the pressure to accuse them of something. What horrible misdeed have they done that the Doom Goats are staring at them? And this will cause social havoc. Water wolves, half-hounds, marsh fiends, murder workers, the night goers, snake tribes. These guys are kind of like goblins, the original inhabitants of Wolfwald. There's orcs, which, as I've said before, are basically zombies in this setting. Spiderwights from the fairy realm come to steal you away. Trolls, werewolves, wild men of the woods, essentially Bigfoot. Slaughter wolves, water warriors. And then there is a creature master list at the back if you just want the quick stat blocks. What I like is that the monsters in this book are not so much focused on having lots of special tactics in combat, which is what a monster manual typically has in D&D. Instead, by having a deep connection to the setting and having a lot of backstory with how they interact with the culture and with the people, this gives you a way to approach the monsters and to see how would these monsters affect the culture and the peoples in the world. So rather than just hearing, oh, there's a monster over there, we'll just rush up and stab it, you might be able to take a more strategic approach and figure out what is causing the monster to exist here and solving these underlying problems. I like how the last section, people, is essentially another monster manual because the worst monsters are always people. All of the different races and classes get a write-up, and just as with the monsters, there is a lot of effort put to tie them into the setting and to get you to understand who they are and where they're coming from, so that you can manipulate and engage with them on a social level and on a cultural and on a mythic level rather than only on just a combat level. One thing that's really neat is how many of the chieftains or kings of each of these different tribes or cultures work as bosses almost. It's like as you rise in level and you become a level 3 character in this game, it's like having a level 10 character in other versions of D&D. That's what these kings are. They're essentially level 10 D&D characters, which means that they are very powerful. Being a king doesn't mean you're a frail old man that you can just walk up to and behead. He got here by being an enormously powerful warrior or having a lot of magic items and allies that he can summon to make sure that he stays on the throne. There's a whole section on the royal household and how that's organized because you're going to have to understand that if you're going to be able to make your way through those social circles. Who his warrior queen is. There's a whole class that's just princes because a prince is a kind of mythological class. It's a type of person that fits within the fiction and within the culture. If you're a prince, then you are vainglorious by definition. You are single-minded, you have a shining future, and you have a retinue. As you get closer to dealing with the most powerful king in Wolfwald, you might have to deal with his champion, cold-blooded killer that he often has go fight his battles for him, his household guard, and then you have this class at the very end, kings, with the most powerful king being Cyneric, son of Cedric, Cyning, however you say that, of the Westlund Siax. This guy is absolutely brutal to deal with, 9 hit dice, 24 armor class, and he is decked out in weapons and armor that are covered in dwarven runes. So he is going to be able to blast you with sorts of magic and protect himself from all sorts of tactics that you might try and pull on him. There's a reason why this guy became the king and a reason why he has stayed the king, and a reason why he has so many loyal warriors and followers. Over here it points out he is the setting's ultimate monster, a man. As an enemy NPC, he should be a tough challenge even for a large party of 3rd level PCs with their own warbands. So instead of fighting the monster or the dragon at the end of a campaign, you have to try and take down the king. I think that's really cool. So there we have Wulfwald, a true labor of love by L. Reynoldson that is put together in a really beautiful fashion in all of these pamphlets. While the fairly minimal stats throughout this feel a lot like BX D&D, the tone really rings to me of original Dungeons & Dragons, where it's much more freeform, it's very much up to GM fiat to figure out how things work, and it's about exploring this strange other world that's a lot like mythic fantasy and incorporates a lot of legends and lore from Earth's history into this grand campaign where the players can strike out and make their own fortune by working for the right guys and trying to work their way up that cultural food chain to become a lord or maybe a king of their own. I also really like that it's in a white box set like original Dungeons & Dragons. Anyway, as usual, I will put links in the description below for where you can pick this up in PDF or in print form. Remember to subscribe to the Questing Beast newsletter or to the Patreon if you want to help support the channel and get my weekly bonus content. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.